Hello again, we are going to be reading chapters 8 and 9 of Awful Auntie this morning. And then we're going to have a little break over the weekend and we'll start again with chapter 10 on Monday. So chapter 8, The Great Escape. Stella had a plan. Racing over to her desk, she grabbed a pencil and a piece of paper. There was a small gap at the bottom of the heavy wooden door. Stella slipped the piece of paper through it. Then, using the sharp end of her pencil, she gently poked the key through the lock. Poke it too hard, and it would miss the paper and land with a loud clang on the wooden floor. That was sure to alert Aunt Alberta. This had to be done very, very slowly. Little by little, the key passed out of the hole. Clunk. Stella caught it with a sheet of paper below. Next, she pulled the paper back under the door. Her face lit up as she saw the key pass through the gap. She clasped it to her chest as if it was the most precious thing in the world. Her hands shook in anticipation. She put the key back into the lock, and like a master criminal cracking a safe, turned it very gently. Click. The door was unlocked. The little girl turned the big brass handle and opened the door. At first, just a crack. She peeped through the gap, checking that the coast was clear. The long, empty corridor stretched out before her. Stella was still barefoot and in her nightdress. There wasn't time to dress properly. Alberta might come back to check on her at any moment. She had to make her escape right now, while she still had the chance. Having lived at Saxby Hall her entire life, Stella knew the house inside out. Without even thinking, she was aware of where every creak in the floor was. Tiptoeing along the corridor, she artfully dodged every squeak. Creeping around like this, she felt like a burglar in her own home. Finally, Stella reached the landing and peered through the balustrades at the top of the stairs. From there, she could just see the huge oak front door of Saxby Hall. When it came to creaks or squeaks, the stairs were even more treacherous than the corridor. The little girl descended the first flight with extreme caution. Halfway down, she heard a noise behind her. Clump, clump, clump. Footsteps. Clump, clump, clump. Someone was coming along the corridor. Clump, clump, clump. Stella looked behind her. Clump, clump, clump. It was only Gibbon, the butler. Stella sighed with relief. Much as Stella wanted to beg him to help her escape, it was no use. The faithful manservant was so ancient now, he had become almost completely deaf and blind. Try as anyone might, there was absolutely no way of getting through to him. He was in a world all of his own. Gibbon's black frock coat was dusty and worn. His white serving gloves were riddled with holes, and his old worn shoes flapped whenever he took a step. However, the butler was marching proudly down the corridor carrying his silver tray. Wobbling on top of it was a tiny pot plant. "Your breakfast, Duchess," he announced as he opened the door to a cupboard and stepped inside. Stella shook her head. The poor old butler was always getting everything wrong. As quickly and quietly as she could, the girl continued descending the stairs. No! She had forgotten the noisiest stair, the very last one up from the entrance hall. To have come all this way and be caught now would be a disaster. At the far end of the corridor, Stella could hear noises coming from her father's study. It was the sound of the room being ransacked. Books and boxes were crashing to the floor, and papers were being scattered. Alberta was talking to herself. She was cursing angrily. "Where have you hidden these blasted deeds?" Stella figured that her aunt wouldn't have heard her, and began to tiptoe across the hall to the front door. The noise gave the little girl a fright. stopped her in her tracks. Ring, 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 ring. But it was only the telephone ringing in what was Papa's study. Ring, ring, ring. Alberta picked it up. Stella stayed dead still to listen. Saxby Hall, Lady Saxby speaking, said the woman. The girl shook her head in disbelief. Alberta might have been Lady Alberta, but she wasn't Lady Saxby. That was Stella's mother's title, and now it was hers. Ah, headmistress, lovely to hear from you. It must be Miss Beresford, the headmistress of Stella's school, St. Agatha's School for Aristocratic Girls. No, she won't be coming back to St. Agatha's any time soon. There is no change, I'm afraid. Yes, she's still in a very deep coma. How could her aunt tell a complete and utter lie like this? No. There's no need for you or any of the girls to visit, thank you. Yes, I know it's Christmas coming up. Yes, well, you can post her present and I will look after it for her. Yes, headmistress, it is a sad situation. Especially for me, as my niece means the world to me. Oh, yes, of course. I'll call you the moment she wakes up. If she ever does, that is. Perhaps we all have to prepare ourselves for the worst. I am so sorry, headmistress, but I'm in floods of tears at the thought. Next came the sound of Alberta wailing. Before she finished, the telephone call with a bright and breezy tulipip, ding. The handset was put back on its hook. Nosy old trout, Alberta muttered to herself. Stella was terrified. Prepare ourselves for the worst. What was the wicked woman planning for her? She had to escape now. The girl tiptoed past the ancient suit of armour that always stood by the front door. She was careful not to brush against the suit or the weapon it was holding in its metal glove. A flail might fall to the floor. The spiked ball and chain was sure to make a loud clank on the floor if it did. Silently, Stella made her way over to the huge oak front door. She turned the handle, but it was locked. Normally, it was only locked from the outside when the family went out, but Alberta had locked it from the inside, presumably to keep her niece in. Since Stella could remember, the numerous keys for this sprawling country house had all been kept in a cupboard by the door. Stella checked the cupboard. It came as no surprise to find it was bare. Alberta must have hidden all the keys somewhere. Next, the girl clambered up onto the windowsill and tried to open the windows. They were locked too. Smashing one was far too risky. The noise of shattering glass was sure to alert her aunt, much more than a squeak in the floor. As Alberta continued her search for the deeds, cursing and emptying boxes in the study, Stella remembered something. Her mamma and papa always kept a secret spare key for themselves under the doormat in case of emergency. Stella was pretty sure Alberta wouldn't have known about it. Lifting up the mat, the old rusty key lay there like a piece of long buried treasure. As she straightened up, holding the key in her hand, Stella slowly realised something. 2 large yellow eyes were staring back at her. The eyes of an owl. It was Wagner. He was hanging upside down from a light fitting on the ceiling, like a bat, a terrifying owly bat. Chapter 9, Hunted Down. If there is one piece of information I hope you take away from this book, it's this. You can't reason with a great Bavarian mountain owl. Oh, Wagner, stuttered Stella. Don't worry about me. I'm just popping out to take in some air. The owl's 2 yellow upside-down eyes narrowed. There's no need to mention this to my lovely aunt. Squawk! Wagner's squawk was deafeningly loud. Squawk, squawk, squawk! Shh! Pleaded the girl. It was no use. You just can't reason with them. Soon the monstrous bird was flapping his vast wings, knocking over the ancient suit of armour and sending it and the flail it was holding in its metal glove falling to the floor with a mighty crash, clatter, rattle. Shh, you stupid bird! It was almost as if the great Bavarian mountain owl understood what the little girl was saying, because this made Wagner squawk and flap his wings even more violently. Within moments, Stella could hear Aunt Alberta thundering out of the study towards her. "Wagner!" she hooted. "Wagner!" Trembling with fear, Stella pushed the key into the lock. It rattled around as she frantically tried to turn it. Out of the corner of her eye, Stella could see her aunt getting closer and closer as she made her way along the corridor. Alberta wasn't a fast runner. Wrestling was more her kind of sport. However, she was advancing steadily, like a tank. After what seemed like an hour, but was probably less than a second, the little girl finally heard the click of the lock turning. Fumbling, she grabbed the handle and hurled herself out into the darkness. The moon was full and low that night. It illuminated the thick covering of snow on the ground. Her feet were moving so fast she could barely feel the cold. As she ran and ran, the little girl could just about make out where she was running to. Nonetheless, she nearly ran straight into the huge snow figure that was being built up on the lawn. Up close, she realised it had to be at least 10 times as tall as her. Looking back over her shoulder, Stella could see her aunt framed in the front doorway, Wagner perched on her hand. The woman was standing still. That she was not chasing after her frightened Stella. It was as if Aunt Alberta was in complete control. "Bring me back that wretched girl!" bellowed the woman, and the great bird launched himself into the air. Stella's heart was pounding now. The towering metal gate at the end of the driveway was still a long way ahead of her. Her feet were clawing up with the cold, and now she was stumbling as she ran. Above her somewhere, Stella could hear the flapping of wings. She looked up at the black sky, but couldn't see where the owl was. The sound of wings was getting louder and louder. Wagner was getting nearer and nearer. From the doorway, Aunt Alberta was calling out commands to her bird. "Stay on course, Wagner, stay on course!" Stella tried to run faster. She ran faster than she ever had in her life. Tonight it felt like she was running for her life. At last she reached the huge iron gates to Saxby Hall. Desperately she pulled at them, and they rattled and rattled, but they wouldn't budge. Aunt Alberta must have locked them too. The girl was completely out of breath. Her feet were cramping up. Her skin was burning with the cold, but she still had some fight left in her. There must be another way out, she thought. She began running around the perimeter wall. It was tall and made of bricks, but there had to be a hole in it somewhere, or a tree she could climb so she could jump over one of the many fields that backed onto Saxby Hall. "Now dive!" shouted Alberta. Stella could hear the great bird speeding through the air behind her. The girl didn't dare look up. She just kept on running. Suddenly, her feet weren't touching the ground anymore. Her legs were still moving, but now she was flying through the air. "Squawk!" came a deafening cry in her ear. She looked in terror to see Wagner's razor-sharp talons wrapped around her shoulders. The giant owl had plucked her from the ground as if he were hunting prey. Stella tried to shake the bird off. Desperately, she lashed out at the fearsome creature with her fists. Wagner suddenly soared higher into the black sky. Stella looked beneath her dangling feet. It was an awfully long way down. If the owl let go now, she would plummet to the ground. It was so terrifying, Stella scrunched up her eyes as tightly as she could. Meanwhile, Aunt Alberta watched as the owl circled in the sky, before returning her niece to the house. A sinister smile crossed her face. And we'll read chapter 10 on Monday. Have a lovely weekend.